Welcome. I'm so grateful for you being here. My name is Keri Brenner, and I'm a palliative care physician and psychiatrist at Stanford. In palliative care, we support patients with serious illness, helping them live well in times of limitation. And as a psychiatrist, I have additional training on the psychological aspects of living with life-limiting illness. Help care for patients in moments of uncertainty, vulnerability, and heightened distress. There are some lessons that I've learned from my patients that I think might have some universal applicability during this time. Similar to when patients face serious illness, in many ways, we currently have all been struggling with limitations we would have never imagined even a few months ago. Many of us have experienced a deeper sense of vulnerability, a range of emotions and worries, feeling like we're fragile, where suddenly we have had to take a pause and to think about life's limitations. And yes, we currently are in a medical pandemic, yet we also are finding ourselves in this pandemic of emotional distress, a pandemic of anxiety, of fear, uncertainty, loss of predictability. And I imagine that this has been a time where each of us has experienced a whole spectrum of intense feelings, maybe helplessness, isolation, irritability, grief, worry, boredom, guilt, loss, or loneliness. And for most of us, we probably find we're not stuck in just one of those emotions, but rather we have many of these emotions, a whole constellation of them throughout the day, or even perhaps multiple emotions in a single moment. And we know that these emotions can have almost a viral effect. They can be contagious. In fact, I've been struck by the ways that this distress seems even more contagious than the virus itself. There was an article last month in a prominent medical journal that talked about the mental health outcomes of healthcare workers in China during the time of coronavirus. 45% of them said they had significant anxiety. Over 70% reported emotional distress. And although we don't quite know the precise impact that this will have on the mental health of our local communities, on us here and now, there are some recent reports that indicate that as many as 40% of Americans are experiencing significant anxiety during this time. These numbers are staggering. And as we know, these intense emotional states can be very powerful. It can overwhelm us. And when it overwhelms us, it can pull us into a fight or flight, or even a freeze mode, as that old adage says. It can cause us to react, to retreat, or even to become resentful at times. As individuals and collectively, we are adapting to circumstances we never would have imagined. Our routine freedoms are being disrupted by quarantines, masks, meticulous hand hygiene, and social distancing. And we just don't know how long we'll be in this together. I often feel like I learn the most through the questions and the experiences that come up from my 3 young children. At home, I have a 4-year-old, a 2-year-old, and a 7-month-old. And the other day, I just totally had to chuckle when I was tucking my 4-year-old in for his afternoon nap. And he sweetly looked up into my eyes and he said, "Mommy, will this whole coronavirus thing be over when I wake up from my nap?" And I just thought, oh, how I wish that were true, David. Oh, how I wish we could all just take a really good nap right now and it would just be behind us. My 4-year-old reminded me of how hard uncertainty is during this time. When will it all be over? And his innocent question actually inspired me to say yes to this webinar here today with you, thinking about how do we respond to this pandemic of distress? How do we start to flatten the curve of distress? And my hope is that in this time together today, we can create a space for us to consider how to be a catalyst of calm in COVID-19, because each of us has the capacity to be a catalyst during this time. The path will be unique for each of us because each of us has a unique set of circumstances and struggles. But each of us also has a very unique set of strengths. And that's what I hope we can explore here together. So let's begin by taking a deep breath together. I want this to be a space where you can engage not just with your intellect or your mind, but with all of your senses, with your gut instincts, to open up all of your senses. And just try to notice if there's anything you might hear or receive that might stir something in you at a deeper level. That could be an area to be explored or to respond to. I'd first want to highlight a few general concepts on being with these distressing emotions. The first observation is that intense emotions are often like waves, like mighty waves. They often feel like they can come crashing in upon us. They can take on this sort of overwhelming strength where we might feel flooded or even like we're drowning at times. But then in time, they eventually calm. They eventually leave us. The tide recedes. Intense emotions ebb and they flow. And that intensity is usually only temporary. Like, just take a moment to recall within yourself that flow of change. Maybe a feeling that you had last week or even last night that's already gone, and a new thought or emotion has filled you. Let's learn together today what carries us through these waves. And one important thing to note is that the ways we reacted to stress before this pandemic usually will be the ways that we react during this time, perhaps in a more amplified way. Our greatest vulnerabilities, our Achilles heels, those struggles we had before, if we were a worrier or had a need for a lot of control, that's likely to be magnified during this time. Even our ways of reacting to others, if you happen to be a more passive aggressive person with your spouse, being cooped up, that passive aggressiveness will get more magnified during this time. So, what do we know about these waves? Well, we know that the more that we resist or deny the emotion, the greater the grip that it has over us, the more that it can flood us and overcome us or even trap us. You know, I've learned the hard way that one of the worst things you can say to somebody who's worrying is stop worrying. I was talking with a colleague the other day and he was getting really anxious, and I said to him, just stop being so anxious, stop worrying so much about all this. And he said, Keri, that's totally the most unhelpful thing you could say right now. That is just keeping me trapped all the more. If we try to resist these emotions or just stay stopped, we just get trapped all the more. It reminds me of those little finger traps, you know, that you get at the fairgrounds or at a kid's party, those Chinese finger traps. The initial reaction when you're in one of those traps is to pull your fingers outward, but that only tightens the grip even stronger. The way to escape the trap, paradoxically, is actually to move your fingers in toward the middle, and that creates a space that frees your fingers from the grip. To not resist, but to lean in. So, how do we not resist these waves and rather begin to lean into them? One way to not resist an emotion is to know that it's not necessarily good or bad. It just is. It's how we choose to respond to these emotions that might cause disruption in our lives. So, this gives us an opportunity to actually be curious about them, to have more of a non judgmental stance about an emotion. So, let's pay attention to the ways that we say to ourselves, oh, I shouldn't be feeling this, because this is a time to be non judgmental. A feeling isn't good or bad or right or wrong, it just is. So, by having that greater awareness and that non judgmental stance, we start to gain more agency over these emotions. I was on a phone call with a close friend last week who started describing the irritability she has with her two middle school children that she's trying to homeschool. And she says that during the day, she feels like she needs to be this perfectly happy, put together mom. But then inevitably around dinner time, she starts taking all of her irritability out on her husband and gets a short fuse with him and even loses her temper at times. And she told me that for the past several days, she started trying a new approach to get out of even that guilt mode. Like at one point, she said, Keri, I just should be grateful. I'm such a lousy mom. Why am I so irritable? I should just be grateful and happy. Other people have it way worse. Well, now she's stuck in this spiral of both her irritability and her guilt. And she's stuck in this impossible ideal that she should always feel happy or always be grateful, when really it's kind of the anger that she needs to work out more. So she started to practice taking a pause before she reacts or says something hurtful that she might regret. And this pause reminded me of one of the insights from Viktor Frankl, who was a psychiatrist in the time of World War II and a Jewish survivor of concentration camps. And Viktor Frankl taught that between stimulus and response, there is a space. And in that space is our power to choose. And in that response lies our growth and our freedom. So instead of simply reacting, she takes a pause. So the other day, she noticed that one of her kids was refusing to do an assignment. And instead of just reacting, she decided to be a bit more curious in her pause. She thought, whoa, I'm getting really upset now. This is what anger feels like, I guess. My heart's racing. I wonder what triggered that one in me. And she told me how she almost thinks of these emotions now in a way of like trick-or-treaters coming to her doorstep at Halloween. And I thought, wow, that's a really creative idea and a comical way to think about it. She said, Keri, at Halloween, you have no idea what kind of little goblin or monster might show up at your front door, but you greet them regardless with amusement and curiosity. And you just sort of say, wow, that's a scary monster. And then eventually it kind of goes on its way. And maybe eventually a princess or a superhero might show up at your door a few minutes later. And I found this a really comical way of thinking about encountering our strong emotions, that maybe they just come to us like trick-or-treaters at our doorstep. They come and they go, and we can be more curious about them. And in that curiosity, have more space to make a choice. My friend says she still gets really irritated when homeschooling her kids, but she allows it to just pass with a bit more ease, not being as reactive or as regretful. One technique that can be helpful with these intense emotions is learning simply how to name the emotion. I'm feeling worried, edgy, stressed, scared. Because often we find ourselves in this sort of nameless dread or angst. But we know that the more we can name the source of distress, name that underlying struggle, the more words we can put to it, the less awful it will be. By naming the distress, we courageously go right into it. We honor the truth of the distress without avoiding it, without fleeing from it. It also allows us to not fall into a pit with it or allow that despair to consume us. By naming it, we authentically show how to hold and bear these realities while still staying intact and whole. I often think of Fred Rogers and his quote when I think of this concept. He said, if it's mentionable, it's manageable. What's mentionable is manageable. So naming the emotion allows us to problem solve in a more personal way. And we know that if we don't acknowledge or verbalize an emotion, it often can come out in these distorted behaviors or unproductive tendencies, like overeating or being swallowed up in social media, or getting caught in that fight or flight or freeze mode, where we might become paralyzed by the emotion or get stuck perhaps in rumination. One additional observation that I want to share with you before we transition over to our panel and some Q&A is about relationships. What makes us thrive in times of crisis? It turns out that our relationships are one of our most precious resources, the people in your midst right now. As humans, we don't do well on our own. We do best when connected with others in trusting, authentic, and supportive ways. In some ways, that's why this social distancing has become so challenging. One of my mentors from residency, Robert Waldinger, directs the Harvard Study of Adult Development. And this study is one of the longest studies of adult life that we know of. For 80 years, it's tracked the lives of over 700 men and then their wives and children. And it began in the 1930s when they were a group of teenagers. This group has endured some of the social upheavals, such as the Great Depression and World War II. And what this study discovered is that the good life is built with good relationships, social connections with close friends and families and community. And that it's the quality of those relationships, not the quantity, that really matters. We find that in these tumultuous moments, it activates that instinctive desire for security with others, to be more connected in these trusting, loving relationships when we're feeling vulnerable. This is a time of crisis, unlike any other most of us have ever lived through. And we will remember this time and we will refer to it throughout our entire life. When we find ourselves at home or stuck in a situation we can't change, we then are challenged to change our very selves and to ask ourselves, how do I live most fully in these limitations? How do I allow this experience to transform me? So we'll now take a few moments to transition to our physician panel. And I encourage you to write in some questions in the Q&A. Before then, we move to the second part of the webinar where we're going to go over some practical tips together.
Hey, Keri, thanks for that. That was beautiful. I thought I might start by just sharing a reflection that I was having as I listened to you. And I apologize because, of course, my gardeners picked this moment to come and be outside the window. But really, as I was hearing you talk about this type of relationship that you are encouraging us all to cultivate with our feelings, I can't help but think of the sort of passengers on the bus metaphor by Stephen Hayes. He was the founder of acceptance and commitment therapy, and it's always been a really powerful and helpful metaphor for me. And for anyone listening who's unfamiliar, the basic idea is to imagine that your life is like a bus, right? And you are the driver of that bus. And the road ahead of you represents all of the situations that we encounter from the outside world, right? Like, I don't know, a global pandemic. And the passengers on the bus, on the other hand, represent all of the internal happenings or experiences inside of us, right? Our thoughts, our feelings, our emotions. And you can hear the passengers back there as you're driving, right? Sometimes they're mumbling kind of quietly, and sometimes they are screaming and obnoxious and so loud, right? And when they start to get too loud, too intense, it's not our job to fight with them, right? It's not our job to try to kick them off the bus, because if you do, they'll just get louder and they'll just get more obnoxious and more intense, right? But it's also not our job to let their loud and powerful voice kind of take over and dictate where we go. Hey, I wanted you to turn left there. No, do this. No, that's scary, right? At the end of the day, the passengers, AKA our feelings, our thoughts, they're going to ebb and flow in their volume, in their intensity. And our only job is just to accept whatever passengers happen to be on our bus at any given time, right? While still maintaining control of the wheel. So I find that I personally think about the bus all the time. I was playing and we're all going to talk about our kids, but I was playing a board game with my kids yesterday, and I got this huge wave of panic and anxiety, and it was so unpleasant to tolerate. And my instinct was to do anything that I could possibly do to stop that feeling. But I took a deep breath and I pictured the bus, right? And I said to that really, really uncomfortable feeling in my chest, I said, okay, hi, anxiety. Looks like you're on the bus right now. Feel free to take a seat, right? You're not the most pleasant passenger, but I'm still the driver of this bus. And right now I'm choosing to play board game with my kids. I guess you're on my team, right? And in this way, I sort of tolerated its presence without fighting it, without being drowned by it either, right? Just accepting that for better or for worse, it was riding on the bus with me right then. And I think, I apologize, because I think in many ways I sort of rephrased just a lot of what the content you've already said, but it's a metaphor that I've always found really helpful to keep in my back pocket when that intense feeling comes, just thinking about it, taking a seat back there. Yeah. And Mariana, I can keep going. I have more thoughts, but I also want to make space for you and also make sure we have space for questions. I can't tell.
Go ahead, Mariana.
Well, I'll keep going then. If that's
okay,
okay.
Danny.
Another thought. Well, one other thought that I had while you were going was that I think it's really hard to have this discussion without taking at least like a little moment to talk about the ideas of mindfulness and meditation. And some of you out there might already have really healthy meditation practices, but others of you out there might feel a little bit like me when you hear the word meditation. You sort of like roll your eyes and you're like, oh, I don't have the time or the patience for that, right? I can't sit with myself. But every time I try it, I get reminded time and time again that it doesn't have to be a daunting commitment, right? You can do a meditation in literally 32 seconds, right? 32 seconds. Who amongst us, I think there's like 290 of us, who doesn't have 32 seconds, right? And in fact, since I don't know if Marianne's going to pop in, so since I'm not sure, I'm going to take a moment and actually ask if you guys will indulge me, and maybe all 290 of us can just volunteer 32 of our seconds right now and try it out. I think, will you guys humor me? I see Keri nodding, thumbs up. Okay, so we're going to do a square meditation. I promise, just half a minute, but it's got four steps, right? So step one is that you inhale to the count of 4 seconds, right? Step 2, hold that inhale at its peak for 4 seconds. Step 3, exhale to the count of 4 seconds. And step 4, hold that exhale at its base for 4 seconds. So simple, right? And while you're doing the 4 steps, I want you guys to try to picture in your mind that you're drawing the 4 sides of a square, right? So one side for each of the steps. Now, the math wizards in the audience right now are probably thinking, Danny, that's actually 16 seconds. And you're absolutely right, but I'm going to have us do it twice. So wherever you are, just get your body into a comfortable position. Close your eyes if it's comfortable for you. Leave them open if you prefer. And just do it with me, right? And I'll kind of speak us through it while you guys do it. So inhale. 2, 3, 4. Hold. 2, 3, 4. Exhale. 2, 3, 4. And hold. 2, 3, 4. And now take a couple breaths and we'll do just one more together. All right. So empty your lungs and inhale. 2. Exhale. Or hold. Exhale. And hold. Right? So simple. Just 2 deep breaths done mindfully, and you get this chance to be a bit more settled, a bit more in touch with your bodies and your experience. And just imagine if every time you picked up the remote to turn on or off the TV, or every time you logged into your email, you gave yourself the gift of 32 seconds, right? Just 2 deep breaths to check in with your body, check in with your experience. Even the most daunted of us by the idea of meditation, I think could offer up a half a minute as a gift to ourselves. So, and now, Mariana, are you there? Keri, you're muted, but I see you moving your mouth.
Hi, everyone. This is Claire again. Mariana, I think we're having some trouble unmuting you. We apologize for that. But since we have quite a few questions, if it's okay, let's go ahead and move into some of those. And Mariana, we'll work with it. I don't know why it's glitchy today. Okay, so one that's very popular question is, how do you handle mourning from COVID death when you can't be with dying or have a funeral?
That's a great question. I think sort of one of the cruelest things about this illness is just what you're talking about, is that it doesn't just hurt our health, it's also taking away our ability to be connected to loved ones, our ability to grieve the way we normally grieve. I've been doing some volunteer work with New York Presbyterian Hospital, mostly making phone calls to family members. And I just spent a really long time yesterday speaking to a woman whose loved one was in the ICU. And the hardest part for her is that she can't hold his hand, right? And she can't pet his head, and she can't tell him, things will be okay. And it's a huge loss for the patient, but it's such a huge loss for families as well, and for loved ones who are all trying to connect or mourn losses. And I can't say that I have a great answer, but I will say that I think we have to try to get to the basic elements that we still can get, right? So yes, we can't meet as a funeral, we can't be hugged by other people, we can't share stories in that way, but what are ways that we still can connect? Can we do, a Zoom meeting? Can we have a forum where people share stories? Can we have something that lets us feel connected to the other people mourning? Because we know that mourning not alone, and mourning in a way where you can celebrate life is so important. I think another way is that we have to find proxies to fill the needs, and they'll never be as good, right? I had one woman who couldn't sit with her sister as she was passing in New York City, and it was terrible. The lady was so sick that it was too much of a risk to have her there. But she said, my sister has always loved stuffed animals. She has always loved stuffed animals. She hasn't had a night in her life. This elderly woman hasn't had a night where she didn't sleep with a stuffed animal. And so we, moved mountains to try to get a stuffed animal into that room. And we had the video on, and she said, can you tuck it under her arm? Can you tuck it under her arm? And it was clear that obviously it would be better if this lady could hug her sister. And yet we found a proxy. We found sort of this transitional object, this other thing that we could do that let her feel like she was there in a way, let her feel like she was cuddling her just like that stuffed animal was cuddling her. And so I think we just go back to the basics and try to find workarounds for them.
Okay, I think maybe we can answer one or two more, and then we'll move to our next section. The next question is, could you please tell us how we should deal with grief of not doing anything when everybody says that we should be super productive during this time? Sometimes it's really hard to convince ourselves to be productive.
Yeah, we cannot underemphasize how much stress there is in the undercurrent of this time, and to be compassionate with ourselves and to set and reset new expectations all the time for ourselves, because the amount of energy it's taking for us to adapt, not only to just every week or month of a shelter in place, but even to every day, the new circumstances, does take a tremendous amount of inner energy, internal emotional energy. And so to be compassionate with ourselves as we make those adaptations.
Great, thank you. And then another question is, how do you help others self-reflect on their negative emotional states?
Creating a holding space for other people can be incredibly nourishing and nurturing for them. And when I say creating a holding space, what I mean is being present to people in that sort of non-judgmental, curious way where they're allowed to have any range of thoughts, hopes, worries, emotions when they're talking to you, and creating that sense of presence with them where you're attuned to not only the nuances of what's said, but also the nuances of what's unsaid. And that is one of the greatest treasures that we can give our trusted inner circle during this time.
Great. Did you want to do another one, or should we move to the next part of the webinar?
Maybe I'll pull up, we can move to the next part of the webinar into practical tips. And then that'll give us more time for our expert panel and for some Q&A at the end. Does that sound okay?
Yes, thank you.
So the next section is for us to think together about practical tips moving forward. We've talked about this inner work of how to be with these emotions and how to have an awareness of those feelings. And now this is sort of how do we allow these emotions to better inform us during this time, to know, as Danny said, where we're going with this bus, how to actually drive the bus forward. So my hope for today is that we can just think together about what might be an idea, one takeaway that would make tomorrow slightly better than today. I was able to actually have a lot of conversations with various people to present this part of the talk. I reached out to loved ones, family, friends, and many of you are actually on this webinar right here and now. And so I'd like to share some of the collective wisdom of the group. First, I found that people are in unique situations and struggles, and they're finding what fits for them. I'm going to give just some snapshots of some of these struggles. A 55-year-old neighbor told me that she has a lot of anxiety and panic with the uncertainty. She's a planner and really likes to have a sense of control. So she has no idea, of course, what's going to happen next month. But she knows that next week she will be in this shelter in place. So she's actually built herself a schedule to create some sense of predictability. She's even scheduled in when she's going to call a friend or make dinner that night, and that's made her feel more grounded in herself. Another neighbor is a 72-year-old woman who's a widow. And she told me that she feels very isolated and disconnected and even helpless during this time. And she decided actually to go into her garage and to pull up some photos and videos and boxes of old memories. And it's actually allowed her to see all the contributions and the legacy that she's given throughout her life. And she's decided in the evenings to just sit on the porch and wave to people as they walk by, to say hello to the neighbors. And she's even decided to pick up the phone and to rekindle a connection with an old friend that when life was a lot busier just sort of evaporated in the busyness. A father with 2 young kids has told me that he feels just absolutely overwhelmed trying to work from home while the daycare is closed down and can't help with the kids. He said that, you know, all these like Zoom cocktail happy hours that people are doing and all these new hobbies are picking up. I don't have an ounce of time for any of that. So what he's decided is when he steps into his backyard, he's noticed that the smallest things bring the greatest delight through the eyes of his 2-year-old toddler. Maybe it's a cloud in the sky or something that is noticed like a bird in the trees. And so he's decided to just take more delight in those small things, to be more intentional about that time and less distracted with a different frame of mind. A single man in his 40s told me he's just downright bored. He hates the monotony of this whole thing. He feels like it's Groundhog Day, and he's like, Keri, this emptiness can't be filled by, another Netflix series or just swiping through more social media. And I told him, I said, well, you're not alone in your boredom, because there was this study of 3,500 Italians a couple weeks ago that said that the second most distressing emotion that they reported was boredom itself. So he's actually allowed this boredom to propel him into deeper questions about his life. What's actually meaningful in my life? What matters to me? He started journaling about that and writing some essays, and decided that being an uncle matters more to him. So he's been reaching out more to his nieces and nephews. Some people noted that they find that they're swinging between these extremes of emotions and states, almost like they're on a swinging pendulum. I noticed this when I talked to my own dad, who's back in Ohio. One day, my dad said to me, Keri, this is no big deal. We're going to still fly out to California next week and see you. And I'm definitely taking that trip to Southeast Asia with your mom in a few months. And then the next day, I talked to him on the phone, and it felt kind of like doomsday. He's like, Keri, I think we're going to be cooped up in here for years, and I might never see you in person again. So people have noticed these sort of swingings between extremes. And a lot of people have said that those patterns of reacting to stress before this time have been getting amplified during these times. That if they were a worrier, or if they tended to shut down or be overly critical, that's what the predominant struggle has been. But it's not just the weaknesses that have been amplified. What was really enlightening when I reached out to many of you on this webinar today is that you were highlighting a lot of the natural strengths that have gotten emboldened during this period. And I was so amazed by the creativity of some of these strengths. Humor. Humor is incredibly uplifting and unifying, just to have a good laugh together. And I know in our world of palliative care, which can be really intense and serious at times, we use humor a lot. And, to not be bashful about humor or to feel guilty about humor, it's a really good adaptive coping mechanism. Music. My mom said that one of her friends sends out a different song every morning in a group text to their group of friends, and they all just listen to it at some point throughout the day to feel connected. Beauty in nature. I chose this image here on this slide because I love thinking about bamboo. Bamboo is one of the most resilient, strong parts of nature, and yet it's also really, really flexible. And that's what we're asked to do during this time, to be resilient and flexible. The hobbies that people have had are just amazing. I mean, people talking to me about new ways of cooking and baking and puzzles and household projects, languages, knitting, reading, crafts, gardening. Also to be able to have more physical activity. So maybe we can't train for a marathon, but one of my friends said, Keri, I can't train for a marathon right now, but I can take that work call just outside on a walk rather than being cooped up on my computer for that 30-minute segment. And new routines that maybe have gotten lost in the past are coming back, like family dinners or game nights. And one thing, it's interesting because although there have been, everyone's had sort of finding unique things that work for them in their particular situations, there's also been some common themes that I noticed in reaching out to many of you. You've told me that staying connected to an inner circle of support has been incredibly helpful. And then it's not necessarily the quantity of those relationships, but it's the quality. One couple that I spoke with who's been married for 50 years said in their toughest times, they just had each other. And sure, there were still squabbles. They still sort of fought over who gets control of the TV remote, but they worked through it. And what mattered is that they stayed unified on the other side. And one of my mentors who I cherish from Mass General Hospital, who's taught me so much about how to be with these intense emotions, Margaret Kramer, she sometimes tells me that these times are like mountain climbing. And this image, I think, holds true for us now. We are climbing into uncharted territory right now. And it would be utterly absurd to climb a mountain and to not have a belayer, to not have somebody that has you on belay, Or if while you're climbing into something uncharted, if you happen to fall or stumble, you end up not falling too far. So I ask myself often, who is my belay? Who are your belays? Who can we rely on to ensure that we're not stumbling too far? And remembering that it's not about perfection. There's going to be squabbles. It's not about perfection. It's about connection. Maintaining a balanced diet, emotionally and interpersonally, people have said has been enormously helpful for them. Asking themselves, what brings consolation? What brings desolation? You know, I found that consuming too much news or media just makes me feel desolate afterwards. So I've tried to limit that consumption to just 10 minutes a day to stay informed. You know, a couple weeks ago, I'd heard that Walmart had all of these like cleaning supplies, household cleaning supplies. This was a desolate moment. I was like, I'm going to Walmart. I put my mask on. I got in my social distance line. I waited outside. I felt like I was kind of going into the trenches to get my cleaning supplies. And afterwards, I just felt totally, utterly exhausted. And then I told myself, I need some consolation here to fill me up again. And so that afternoon, my family and I, we went to a garden prayer area nearby and just spent some time that afternoon around this garden with a Mother Teresa statue that I love. And it was those good and edifying moments that will help us carry us through these tougher times to be a resource, those moments of consolation carrying us through. Also, focusing our attention on immediate spheres of influence was another point and insight that you all have shared with me. A few weeks ago, one of my friends pointed out, he said, you know, Keri, I can't affect what's happening in northern Italy right now, but I know I can influence my relationship with my spouse. And I know that I can have an effect and an immediate influence on a relationship with a colleague during a business call, or even picking up an extra loaf of bread for my neighbor when I'm at the store anyway. Or, you know, my wife has been sewing some masks just to help a few friends. And this, I find, has been enormously helpful because our ability to focus on our immediate spheres of influence really empowers us toward change. You know, in the hospital, when I'm with that set of patients for the day, they have my total undivided presence and attention. And then going home, there's a sign that I have above my door when I walk through the door that says, if you want to bring happiness to the whole world, go home and love your family, a quote by Mother Teresa. And that has my undivided attention and presence with my family during this time. And this presence takes a sort of fidelity to those normal, everyday, sometimes even really mundane elements of our life. That fidelity to the ordinary is extraordinary. The fidelity to the ordinary is extraordinary. A final reflection before we transition to more Q&A. Many of you have noted to me that this has been a time where you felt like life has been fragmented, like those everyday routines are just shattered. And it's reminded me of this traditional Japanese art technique called kintsugi. Kintsugi is where the artist takes a piece of pottery that's been totally broken and brings it back together with precious metals like gold. It's a golden rejoining where the brokenness lies in the beauty. So those parts of us that feel fragmented right now they do have the opportunity to become whole and intact again. Perhaps even transforming us into something that's more radiant and authentic. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Brenner. Did you all want to move right into some of the questions?
Yeah, I think we should.
That's great.
Okay, so this one is, when people are feeling a threat to their lives, it seems to be there are those who react with hostility and frustration towards others. They don't know, like on next door, strangers, social media, on the street. How can we not respond to such negativity or let it slide by us? In other words, social isolation can be comforting when you don't have to deal with other people's unhealthy energy.
Yeah. Next door is a landmine, right? Good place. can I jump on this one, Keri? So, I mean, I think the first thing I want to say about that is, so Keri mentioned how like our feelings are neither good or bad. And I would put the caveat to that, they're neither good or bad, but they still can be pleasant or unpleasant, right? Some of these feelings, though not bad, can be really unpleasant, right? And that feeling that you guys are describing, whoever asked this question, when someone else is, projecting all this anger or upsetness sort of at you and at the world, that feeling is a really unpleasant one. We get it a lot in palliative care, not because families are mean, but because they're in times of such high stress and intensity that that's just how some people cope. So I think the first step is one you've already done in your question, which is hold on to the insight that this doesn't necessarily have to do with me. This might just be someone else who's coping as best they can. And then I would say that the second step is you don't necessarily have to, hate that bad feeling it brought up into you. It's a feeling just like any other feeling, like Keri was saying. So I would say that's the moment to say, gosh, I'm going to take a deep breath and notice that I feel really hurt, or I feel really frustrated, or I feel really angry by what this other person is putting out there that's getting into me. And go back, at least for me, right? Go back to the bus, right? I'm not going to try to get that to go away, but I'm not also going to get super riled up and engaged in this crazy next door thing about morals and kindness and stuff. I'm just going to say, okay, probably going to feel a little bit down or hurt today because that person did that. That's on the bus. How am I going to drive it? Like, what's next? Treat it like any other feeling. I don't know, Keri or Mariana.
I don't know if you can hear me now. Is it
possible?
Yeah. Oh, how wonderful. Technology and its wonderful challenges. So I think one thing that brings up for me, Danny, as you're talking, is thinking about, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? So thinking about just some of our basic needs that we need to be addressed right away. So, basic things like physiologically, like I need a glass of water, I need nutrition, feeling safe. This is a hard time to feel safe. And then incrementally, thinking about our social needs, the esteem needs, and then at the top of the pyramid is this idea of self-actualization. I think we can all sort of accept that maybe this is not the time that we're going to achieve self-actualization, and providing ourselves a little bit of forgiveness for that. And so it sort of comes back to this idea of let's just think about the basics, right? Thinking about physiologically what we can do. And also, I think to add to what Danny is saying is thinking about that we have to take care of ourselves first before we can, project this idea of calm towards others. So if we ourselves don't feel calm, we're not able to do that. It makes me think of when we have flight attendants giving us our education when we fly a plane, they always say, put your oxygen on mask. Your mask on first before you're helping any minors next to you. And I think that that's the first thing that comes to mind for me now, right? I can't show my daughter how to be calm. I can't show my colleagues how to be calm unless I find that within myself. And sometimes that's just about drinking a glass of water, right? Taking that time and really enjoying that glass of water and taking those seconds, or doing an exercise the way Danny was doing earlier with us and just breathing.
Great, thank you all. The next question is, I've been expected to work full-time and work in a supportive role with a lot of stress and pressure. It seems we're all seeming to be expected to work as if nothing is any different, no pause, no support to our teams. Any suggestions of how to protect ourselves and have processing time?
I think when we did the breathing exercise earlier, one of the things I was hoping would come across is that you don't need, the more time the better, but you don't need too much time to do this work. So I so appreciate this question, because for any of you out there who are on teams that round together, if leadership or if the systems aren't putting these little spaces in for you, I would encourage you to do it for yourselves, but also for your teams, right? What if at the start of every round you had everyone take 32 seconds, right? Take 2 breaths together and then share one word. What is the predominant feeling that you're feeling right now? Right? You guys don't have to go into an in-depth conversation, but what if one person says overwhelmed, the next says anxious, the next says calm? Just creating a space for people to say it and have it heard and feel connected, even in the smallest of ways, can be so validating, because I agree there's been a lot of invalidation going around in a culture that keeps saying just act like normal, work like normal.
The other thing when we're called to intense work is I think of these new rituals in our life. You know, we're spending all this time washing our hands, and in medicine, donning and doffing, and using that as an opportunity to put whatever intense emotion I had in that one moment behind me as I move on to the next moment and the next patient. You know, there's enough suffering to go around. We don't need to carry the baggage of other people's suffering with us when we transition to another conversation or an encounter. We don't need to live vicariously through the sufferings of others or over-identify with others. Our way of being present and grounded with them also includes this ability to transition ourselves to the next moment.
Great.
And I think one of the commenters mentioned that Stanford is having, maybe we can link to it, but Stanford offers a free like meditation group on Zoom once weekly. But I imagine that there are lots of resources out there that everybody can tap into that others are thinking through.
We will have a list of resources that we will give to all of you in an email follow-up after this webinar. So please feel free to utilize them, and it will teach you a little bit more practical techniques on how to have this kind of mindfulness.
Great. I think this may be one of our last questions, or second to last, but this is addressed towards therapists. So it's, how can therapists support first responders who are emotionally and physically exhausted and have limited support systems?
So right now, I think that's a really wonderful question. I think sometimes it's a lot about the way you're asking questions. So I think one way to ask questions, instead of saying, how are you doing? I think sometimes being really focused with a question that you want to ask a first responder that like, how are you doing right now? What was the hardest thing about your day today, right? Trying to be so focused in the present. And then helping and asking questions such as, what do you need right now? How can you care for yourself in the coming days? Like trying to find, small spaces of time, and even reminding them just to have that drink of water again, just finding the time to wash your hands peacefully without any distractions. I think that's a really good starting point. There are a lot of other resources that are available. I don't know if Danny and Keri want to talk about those, but there are actually quite a lot of hotlines that have been set up across the country for first responders. So you can also direct them in that direction if you'd like to.
Yeah,
and we'll have to link to those hotlines too.
Oh, good. I was going to say, I think it's the rare first responder who's actually connected to a therapist, which is so unfortunate at this time, right? So I think we do need to systematically be thinking at more organizational levels, like how do we make access to mental health support available and potentially anonymous if that's a barrier, and streamline access to it. And then how do we change a culture that has really always celebrated first responders and people in the medical field, toughing it out, right? We don't have a culture that celebrates first responders who ask for help. We have a culture that celebrates first responders who are really tough. So I think creating access and changing culture at a more systems level will be what we need, because most of us who have any therapy training are itching to find a way to help.
Danny, I'm just going to pull up this final slide here. This will be a list of some resources that we'll share with you in the email after. Go ahead, Danny.
Oh, no, you go.
So as we conclude and end this time today, I just want to invite you to this question. What might I take with me that would make tomorrow slightly better than today? Thank you so much for being here with us in this space, and we hope that you can take something that will make tomorrow slightly better.
Thank you everybody for joining, and a big thanks to our panelists and to Dr. Brenner for spending this hour with us. And we will send out the email with the survey and the resources soon, and the recording should be up on our website and our YouTube channel, hopefully within the next week. I apologize to some people, the sound was off if you're not in the United States, but we thank all of you for being with us, and have a safe and happy and healthy weekend and month of May. Bye.
Bye.